Welcome everybody. Blessed are those that visit this channel and enjoy the content here.
This is episode 7 of Watch the Overture. Usual host, and are you from like Austria or Germany? I've never actually asked you that. I don't ask people personal questions until I'm live on shows. You know, from Germany? Okay.
Yeah, Germany.
To be fair, Germany was once part of an Austrian empire, so a lot of people don't know Germany wasn't a real country until a few centuries ago. It was just like Prussia and then Austria, and then there was a little bit of period where shit popped off, but eventually got reined in. I can't lie, you're doing well for a while. Right, so obviously this is one of those episodes where we have a guest, and this time we haven't just been lazy and gotten Sideshow to just tell us all the contents of his brain for that week, which is probably the easiest way for anyone to make video content, I've noticed. This time we've got Volamel, who is a young, up-and-coming rookie journalist who one day aspires to receive press passes, to be allowed to cover the league. I mean, here's the problem. He is a white male, so obviously, we're going to hope he doesn't get too much advancement in the industry, because he would be occupying spaces that could be taken by a more diverse crowd. But aside from that, I think fair play, despite those obvious disadvantages, you're doing pretty decent. You're doing all right. You're still doing a lot of pieces, a lot of profile pieces, right?
I just wrote one kind of detailing part of London Spitfire's team and their kind of history. But thanks for the kudos. Appreciate it.
I love it when you do pieces, which, by the way, to me should be the most interesting piece, where you'll take like a current Overwatch pro who's like a big name, and then you detail, what they did in Apex and where they came from. And then all these people who are like, I'm the #1 Soul Dynasty fan, are like, I don't give a flying fuck about any of this. There was no Overwatch before the Overwatch League, and they just close the article immediately. But, don't let it get you down or anything. I like them.
Appreciate it.
So anyway, along those lines, this episode is going to be about a topic like that, which is narratives. And so how do we tell stories around the league? What's the significance of doing that? How should we do it? Because I have to say, I'll start out like this. This is an area where I actually feel as though esports absolutely should not be taking cues from traditional sports, because I actually have tended to find in traditional sports, they're very, very lazy about their narratives, actually. Like, one of the most famous ones they used to do in British soccer, for example, is they would quote like head-to-head records of teams over like a 30-year span of time. And I'm not joking. They would be like, well, the last 15 times Norwich City played Stoke, they won them, so can they get revenge now? It's like none of the players are in that team, mate. That was like 1975 and nobody's playing from that. So it doesn't make any sense to make that a narrative. Like, that's you've just created a fictional narrative there. Like, none of them are battling for revenge. In fact, my favourite has to be in League of Legends. We had one similar where they used to say, course, the Fnatic team that won Season 1 championship, and at the time they had 2 players who'd won the Season 1 championship and 2 players who'd come second in the same team. So like, how does that narrative work? So they simultaneously won and lost the Season 1 championship all in their team, and that somehow informs their narrative. So again, as you sort of see in here, despite the fact on one hand, love narratives, I think they're some of the best things we can do. Other hand, hate them, because a lot of them are fraudulent as fuck. So where do you come down on this, Volamel? Because obviously when you're writing profile pieces, if you can find a good narrative, if one emerges, if you can figure out like a way to tie aspects together, it makes the story better, right?
No, 100%. It's kind of the season of what we're cooking in esports these days. It feels like the kind of big narratives are around the players themselves, and we're kind of doing a disservice to them if we don't delve into their history and who they are as people and how that ties together in some kind of grandiose, overarching kind of story that is easily edible to the general audience, and they get kind of gripped by it and interested in it. So not only is it about informing, but it's about fun storytelling in very creative ways, and just trying to get people more interested than just at like surface level, like, yeah, I'm EQO, I'm from Spain, vote for me, I'm Spanish. Like, that's cool, but talk about like where he came from as a support player, movie star writers.
He meant Neptuno there, but okay. You said EQO, but
yeah,
we get you. Okay,
Israeli, not Spanish.
It's all right. So. It's all right. We get you. Right, Yiska, you seem like a man that enjoys the narrative, but also gets triggered by a false narrative.
Yeah, I mean, like, the thing is, what Joe said about narratives being very important for players that they're written, because it's sort of part of the package of what you should be receiving from your occupation there. I understand that fans are just inherently like super selfish, and you can't probably water their mouth with that alone. But what I will say is that I always found, even when I wasn't myself creating them, or just as a consumer, it also really enhances the enjoyment for me. For like, it's basically the build up of, if you want a season or a story arc that then develops. And if you don't have these narratives, then that is obviously a problem for the weight of the final, how you perceive them and whatever. And I personally also thought that this sort of hampered the enjoyment of the Overwatch League finals. Though I have to be fair, I think the job that the actual broadcasting team at the finals broadcast did in that department was pretty good. I just didn't agree with the run up to it and what the media surrounding it were basically coming up with.
Like what? Give us an example of some of that bothered you.
Well, the thing is, it's basically a negative. Like, I don't think I've seen a single player piece by either the Overwatch League's website or any journalistic website that comes to mind for me where professionals work. Like, literally 0 pieces. And then the counter argument to this was, well, they did some on EQO in the first broadcast of the playoffs. Well, that's not enough. That's not how you build it. And it is especially egregious to me because apparently everything else was more important. Like, we had pieces about Robert Kraft. We had pieces about Chef Heidi, the fucking cook from that team. I understand that she plays a part in that story. That's sort of like the fantasy author that writes like a main narrative, and then the fans are like, oh, there's a cool side character. Maybe you can extrapolate. That's completely fine if that happens. But you need the main story first for this to matter, right? I felt like the focus was completely mishandled, just as a complete profession goes. I also can't believe that this was like an editor's choice. Like, how does that go? Like, you come into the office and go like, well, I want to write a feature piece about profit, and the editor's like, well, I would let you write this, but did you know that DJ Khaled still didn't fillet a woman? It's like, come on, man.
Get your priorities straight.
It's mad. And that's really, I think, and I also, by the way, completely don't exclude myself from that criticism, because I myself borderline considered a moral imperative to do that, and because more for the reasons towards the players, because I think they should be championed for what they're doing, because let's be real, none of us are, or on average, if I'm making a general statement, none of us are this invested into their craft as they are. It's not the same. Even if you do work 12 hours, you don't really apply yourself for 12 hours, do you? So
okay.
It was that kind of big tone shift that I kind of agree with you that, the whole season was built up around the players. I think the Overwatch League website did do a fairly decent job at, trying to get inside the players' heads and trying to get, more of their personality out there and, try to craft narratives around that. And they did a good job. And then in the finals, it felt like, and I don't think it was necessarily a collective agreement, but it felt like everything just shifted away from the players for the most part. It was like, let's talk about the event. Let's talk about the stadium. Let's kind of tour New York. Let's, talk about DJ Khaled and the event as a whole, and, kind of post-mortem. And I never got that conclusion to the story. I'm at the end of the book and it's just like, and then DJ Khaled came on stage, the end. And it's like, it's this really horrible cliffhanger that I think the entirety of the league just fell. They just really dropped the ball, it felt like.
I mean, if you need a test for this principle, right? If you just follow the media circus around the Overwatch League playoffs, you would have never seen profit coming from in the way he did, right? No. While he was popping off like this all season. Like, I'm sounding like a madman repeating that.
Here's the thing, Yiska, that is a very famous lazy narrative. They do it right now in the LCK. So if SK Telecom's bad, people then write up Faker's having an off year. It's like, what does that have to do with his team being bad? Like, if you notice, that's a general principle. where you can tell the people who don't really follow the game in depth or don't understand it, is that they literally think like the best team has the best players, and the team that isn't the best can't have like the best player at their role, for example, unless of course it's a flex tank from Korea. But aside from that, then apparently, yeah, you can even be on the worst team and be fucking super MVP levels, I would say. But anyway, that's a digression. That's just a teaser there. So okay, right, Yiska though, this is something where here's a story from Esports Old from Yonder. Are you ready? So in the early days of esports, there was a man called Carmack. And if you know, he currently works for ESL. He's like, I'm not sure what his title now is, but he used to be like the product manager of IEM. I think he's still some like, senior VP or some title like that. And up until about 2008, he was a journalist. And me and him were two of the main journalists coming from Quake. And then depending on what game it was at different points in time, sometimes he'd be in Quake 4 and I would be in Counter-Strike or whatever, And believe it or not, hard to believe this could be the case with me, but me and him didn't really get along very early on. And one of our first arguments, and this really is like, it's so ancient but always relevant that it's like the equivalent of that famous argument between like Plato and Aristotle as to whether like, consuming like, violent or tragic material, does it like have a cathartic effect or does it corrupt you in itself? It's like that classic like difference in principles. So what happened was throughout Carmack's career, he always put emphasis on who the player is as a person. Like he cares, what did their family think? Or, why do they want to play the game? Or what did they feel when they went into a match, Whereas my whole perspective was more like, I've often said jokingly that like, I don't really care what like a 19-year-old Swedish kid is like as a person who has no life experience.
Yeah.
I care about like the sick guy in the server who's just a god and the way he plays like dominates. So I always went the other way. I always went like in-game aspects, and any story I tell is going to be more along the lines of like the mythic elements of who this guy is and what he represents, and then what his career story meant. And here's the thing, it is like a fundamental difference. Like it's not like one person's wrong or right, because I have to say, looking through history, not only is the Carmack approach generally the more popular one for narratives. So, for example, when you're talking about these Overwatch pieces, those are the profiles I saw. It would be like, let's talk about Sabio B, and I'm like, cool, this is going to be awesome, right? So one of the best Tracer duelists, like he has a really weird mentality, he could come from LW. Oh, right, you just mean his wife.
Your wife,
right,
by the way, yeah.
My mistake.
Or his dog.
Yeah, he's playing for his wife. Right, okay, well, I mean, that's cool for someone, I guess, but you kind of killed it for me. Likewise, it would always be this angle they'd go with. So I have to say, that is the general way people do it. And it does seem like some people like it, because it's a very famous, cynical statement, right? That in the UK, when we have those shows like Britain's Got Talent and, Pop Idol or whatever, what they famously do with the structure of those shows is in the early rounds where, like they're just letting like half the people through and you're never going to win the show itself. It's like the early rounds are usually about either show someone who's really bad so everyone can laugh at them briefly as they don't make it, or you show people where they're not going to win because they're not actually good enough at singing, but they had AIDS, or their dad died, or they were a heroin junkie, and the idea is it's just a feel-good story. Like, you're pulling for that guy to make it through, and he's not going to win, but you just want him to make it through this round. Like, that feels like it is a powerful draw. Like, for casuals especially who don't know the game, I do think that probably has it seems to draw people in.
No, 100%. I think that's some of the most I don't like to use the word because it's a little, condescending or sounds kind of like too businessy, but it is a lot of activation that I've seen when you have like a title that is like, oh yeah, I kind of are playing for my wife, like with say Bjolby, or I think I wrote one about the British Hurricane, the London Spitfires contenders team, about their main tank Fusions and how his mom is, always telling everybody and kind of praising him, and oh, my son plays video games and it's awesome, and plays it, gets money for it and travels the world. And I think that ties people in and kind of grips them in a sense that the same way to the kind of pop idol scenario where it is a feel good thing, and maybe it kind of instills a little bit of inspiration where it's like, oh, well, if he can do it and he's so young, well, maybe I can do it too. And whereas if you're talking about like super historical, very, very dry, kind of dull, specific niche narratives, I think then you just tend to lose people, because it's like you have to be invested in this and be interested in it already to want to dive back, 10 or I guess 2 years in Overwatch, but to go all the way back to like 2 years ago and look at how they began as players and what their struggles were and how they adapted and overcame their style and stuff like that. So it's something that's very general and edible versus something that you have to already be into. So yeah, I think it is very easy for just anybody to get into.
Yeah, I think personally, for me, I would always prefer to have, like, the content of the story shouldn't be the identity of the player. It should always be a concept or an idea or a value that is highlighted. So, for instance, if we take in the OGN video that they did on Faker, and I would recommend watching this simply because for the production value, it was probably one of the more advanced stuff. Like, I would have cut down most of that stuff, especially like the eating with the family stuff. I would have called it the burden of excellence or whatever. And I would have only focused in on the aspect of someone having fallen from grace, from being a literal god and trying to get back on his feet. This, to me, is the metaphorical juice, if you want, that then helps other people grow from that experience as well. You don't need to necessarily make it as explicit. You can do it implicitly. But if you then, like, does it really matter, like, what he's having for dinner then? It's not focused enough for me. It's not really essentialized too much what it could be about, so we can all relate, and it sort of drowns out the actual narrative often.
Okay. Because one of the things that, this is one of the areas I'm torn on this, is that obviously I prefer that sort of like mythological, archetypal type narrative, you know, but this is one of the reasons why I'm just going to be very, very cynical and say that I think the reason most people don't do those stories is those journalists who don't do them aren't interested in that level of the game, and they don't tend to even know the basics of the person's career history and what they did. They're just focused on how much does he practice and what's it like for a Korean to be in LA and what food do they, you know, like it's very surface level stuff, but that's all they can do. They haven't been invested in the game. They don't know the storylines. Because to me, it's like there's a great concept that Hemingway came up with. It's called the iceberg theory, and the idea is if you do an amazing job when you write, your writing should be like the tip of the iceberg. And even though you're not mentioning all, you know, obviously everyone knows famously an iceberg, the majority is underwater. Mm-hmm. The notion is if you do a good enough job, the rest of it will somehow be intuitively felt by the reader. They don't need to know every other detail, but they'll get that. And I actually feel that's how these narratives work and why I think they're really powerful if you do them the right way. But you've got to have the grounding in them to not just be making them up out your arse, you know, because first of all, I've tended to find that I don't feel like I make up the narratives. Like I feel like what happens is when I look at someone's career enough and I think about it enough, it feels like it's an emergent property. Like I just start to see like, oh, what, you know, what kind of person is this? Or what is his story like? You know, did he always lose in the semi-finals and people said he choked, but he says he doesn't and he was just unlucky, you know, like I'm trying to get a sense of who he is in that sense and tie it into what he's doing in the game. And I have to say, when you do it well, this is the part I think is misunderstood, is that people think naively that you have to reference everything about the game. But I actually think it taps into the same thing, because I think when you do a really good story about esports, you don't even mention the game. Like I could give you a great example, okay, of like in CSGO at the moment, okay, the best player is a player called Simple. And for the last, say, year and a half, he's been absolutely one of the best players in the world. But for the last year, he was in a scenario where he just couldn't win. Like his team wasn't good enough to win. And so all the discussion around him was like, oh, well, does the fact that he's like one of the best players but doesn't win, does that mean it's his fault? Like, does he play too selfishly somehow? Like, does he have to change how he plays, you know? And even when he got to the point where, like, you know, now his team could maybe win a tournament, etc., like the story there doesn't even have to, I haven't even mentioned what he does in the game yet or anything. Like, you're already starting to think, oh, right, what happens to him eventually then? Does he break through in the end? Does he succeed in that way? Does he have to change his playing style, or does he keep going, you know? Like, that's, I think that draws someone in who doesn't even know about the game, you know? They wouldn't even have to, they haven't encountered anything yet. That in theory inhibits them from understanding what's interesting about this story.
Yeah. It's also, it's sort of like witnessing the birth of a god in a sense, right? Like, I guess we could say that at this point this is sort of established for Simple, but it wasn't before, right? Like and this could also be very much the case in the Overwatch League. What if Prophet continues to dominate for another 2 seasons or whatever? Nobody actually at all framed the development of him so far. Like sometimes, to me, it often feels like when I wrote narrative pieces, I look at the game, I look at the records, I look at how these players interact and whatever, and I'm like, okay, I guess I should first 30 minutes, I should probably try to find the article someone obviously must have written, because it's so obvious, this narrative to me, that like, it's like, it seems to be so apparent to me that this should have been framed
here's
that
an
way.
obvious one, right? Is like, how did we get through the entire Overwatch League? And except for you, Volamel, I don't think anyone ever actually wrote a narrative piece about the LW like choking like playoff curse, even though that was one of the most obvious ones, which, by the way, should have been set up in two ways. Early on, it should have been set up to contrast, they've come past that, they're winning now, it's not a problem. And then it would have been even more powerful when they then blew the semis, because now it would be like, oh, does this like connect into that in some way? Even if you end up doing in the article, like saying, well, actually, it's a different lineup and things were different and the metas, even if you ended up unpacking it, the narrative still sort of like has a validity to it, even if it doesn't end up being one you agree with. It's kind of an interesting way to frame the story, I think.
100%. And it was a similar story, not to go off on a tangent, but with Soul.
Always go off on tangents, man.
All right, tangent it is. All right, we're going into Lunatic High. So that was the big kind of storyline with Lunatic High, where they came off of APAC and they lost to Rogue in some sort of reverse sweep where they beat them twice in the regular stage, and then they lost to them in the grand finals in some crazy best of 5, and that was kind of like when I started to get invested into it. And then they went, I believe, to another tournament. I think it was actually APAC Season 1, and they just bombed out in the groups. And it was like, okay, well, if this is like one of the best teams in the world, well, why aren't they kind of performing? And I kind of drew up the narrative that maybe you could like them to the kind of Kong curse and StarCraft, and they had like silver blood and these all crazy big themes and stuff. And it plays parallel to LW, because if you remember back to like IEM Gyeonggi, they lost to LW in the final, and it's like that kind of that was the only tournament that they actually kind of won, if you kind of bar stages, even though stages matter. But I don't know. I'm still kind of debating in my head if I want to pick and choose whether they matter or whether they don't. It's difficult to tell, but those two kind of stories mimic each other very well. And I thought that we touched the surface on. I think on the broadcast they did a pretty good job of explaining why this was kind of a disappointment from Seoul, but I think it probably could have gone more in depth, and maybe I'll do that, because that's kind of an interesting dichotomy between the two teams, because they have been kind of rivals for so long, and they kind of share a similar story where they like are good, they're good enough to win, they are kind of world beaters, but they never kind of meet the expectations that they're kind of that surround them.
Yeah. That's also, though, why I actually got mad triggered. Like, if you notice on like Oversight, it was very, very early on where Monty and others were saying to me, like, the stage playoffs don't really matter, and I was just going like, what the fuck are you talking? Wait, why are you saying that? Like, we've basically got 4 little tournaments as well as the regular season. Obviously, this is cool as fuck, because to me, that's one aspect that I think is a big flaw of the Overwatch League, is if you make it a league, I've seen this from NLCS. LCS can never deliver the same narratives, because the week-to-week play just all blends into one, all kind of washes away, and in the end, by some mad results-orientated thinking, gets overwritten no matter what happened by how you finish in the playoffs. So famously, like there was actually an example where Team Liquid in League of Legends had that famous meme where they used to finish fourth all the time. They would like never make the finals. There was actually one split where I think they were actually the number 1 team in the regular split, but because they ended up finishing, I think they actually finished 3rd in that one, but it was the year where finishing 3rd didn't qualify for Worlds, which obviously in itself fits into a mad narrative. Where, again, if you go back in time, I think, I'm not joking, most League of Legends fans who watched that split couldn't even tell you that they finished first in the regular split. Like, they don't know that part of the narrative actually makes it more important that they then blew it in the semis and then, didn't make it to the final, didn't make it to Worlds. Like, they don't realize that actually sets up a really awesome narrative, but you got to have that first part. And if it's just week to week to week, you're going to lose a lot of it, especially because probably the worst aspect of league formats is there's no through line from what's happening game to game, because I play Seoul Dynasty now, but then the next game I play Shanghai Dragons, and then after that I play NYXL. So in that scenario, it's not really about whether I go 3-0 or 0-3, it's about which one do I beat and in what order, because this is a classic thing the League of Legends casters used to do in the early days. They don't do it as much now, is they would act as though each game was uniform, and they would say dumb shit, like you would lose, let's say you were the 3rd best team in the NALCS, and you would lose a game to TSM, but then your next 2 games are against the bottom teams in the league and you win them. They would spin it like they bounced right back from that loss. This week they're much stronger. It's like, well, they were playing different teams. Like, that narrative is imaginary. It's just nothing. Like, in fact, if anything, that narrative omits the really interesting part and covers up the reality of the scenario. It's a fake narrative. There's nothing to it. It's just air.
Yeah. I also think in a sense, like Joe just said, I don't even know if I should care about these stage playoffs or not. I think there is a function in journalists.
Are you going to be calling him Joe the whole time? Like, I don't. Here's the thing. I'll tell you right now. A little tangent. I have never called almost anyone I know in esports by their name. Like, so for example, I've been a long time friend of a guy called Lurpis, who's from Finland, over 10 years now. I think I might have called him Tommy, his name, once ever. Otherwise, even if we're in private, it's Lurpis. And that's because I actually think this ties into the narrative aspect. Like, to me, the coolest part is, like I say, it's not about whether he was some like 22-year-old Finnish guy who was trying to like do a degree in finance while being a gamer. The cool part to me is, like, you remember the first Matrix movie? One of my favorite scenes, this is the reason why I always tell people, do not get rid of aliases, because aliases add so much flavor, character. They're sort of like, they end up being the label that everything you do as a player gets attached to. So famously, even if you've got an alias that's kind of silly, like for example in CSGO we have a player called Get Right. Now that sounds like an awesome name because he's a fucking badass and he's one of the best players of all time. If that's the name of the shittest player in the league, you would laugh at that name. But you see how actually all the meaning from that name came from what he did in the game. So you know that scene at the end of the first Matrix movie where he's fighting Agent Smith, even though he's been told to like exit the Matrix, you know, he refuses to leave from that telephone booth where they all get out. And he stays and fights Agent Smith in that like underground station. And obviously at this point in time, he hasn't actually become the one. So he's not going to win the fight. But the idea is he's kind of like showing like, you know, like, fuck you, like I can do this or whatever. And there's that epic scene where Agent Smith's like strangling him. And he's like, you know, like, I can't remember the line, but it's something like, you know, this appears to be the end, Mr. Anderson. And then he does that epic line where he just says like, my name is Neo, and then just smashes him in the ceiling. And that's exactly how I feel about the narratives. That's what the actual imaginary element of it, because it's grounded in reality, like it starts in reality, is better than the reality. Like the reality of like the fact that Prophet's like a guy who looks like he's fucking been starved half to death and a 14-year-old boy is not particularly cool, you know. But if you take that and then you're like, but you know what? See that guy there? You'd never realize it, but he's a fucking killer in the game, you know. He's got a mad, like, clutch gene. Like, he's able to, like... That's a sick story. You take the reality and you build it into the awesome story.
Yeah, definitely. No, but back to the point. I think journalists have at least some power in creating that meaning that not only translates to the players, because players inherently, at least most of them, like want that recognition and want those pieces written about them and also want to be nominated for MVP titles. That can then translate to the players, but also to the audience. And by creating those narrative pieces, and I think narrative is actually the strongest tool in that department, can make those stage playoffs meaningful themselves. Yes, the biggest part is probably still on Blizzard to make the system around the playoffs meaningful, but that doesn't mean we don't need to like inherently say, oh, well, I guess they don't matter as much. Like we're not playing for anything other than those $100,000. They don't mean anything to winning the league. Why care? No, we could absolutely care. We could just decide that these are milestone achievements. Which
you know what I think celebrate. They should do? I think they should do something in the vein of, because one of my favorite narrative tools of all time is where in StarCraft Brood War, in the OSL, you won a badge if you won the league. And that's because, by the way, a lot of great players only won maybe one league in their whole career. And famously, if you got 3 badges in the OSL, you got the golden mouse, and in the MSL, you got a golden badge. And what that meant was, every time you were in an interview, so for example, the most famous one obviously is Nada, because he had 6 of them, he would just have 6 pins on his uniform.
And he just flashes them.
He doesn't even have to say anything there. Like, you can't be a guy like talking trash to him, like, I will beat you, Nada. It's like, boy, look at, do you see my shirt here? Do you see this shit? I'm first ballot Hall of Fame boy. Like, you know, it's like, that's straight fire. So, like, I think they should have done something like that. Like, if you win a stage, you get a little pin or you get a fucking line or something. I don't know what it would be. You'd have to come up with some angle for it, you know, but I think they should have done something like that. And that way, because remember, there's only going to be 4 each season, so it's not like anyone's going to have no one's going to have some mad 16 pins on their jersey or something. You know, it's a very competitive league, so it would mean a lot if you saw, like, for example, let's take the exact same example. Now imagine you see the NYXL lose in the semi-finals, and on all their jerseys, as they're all destroyed, they've got 2 pins.
Right? Yeah,
that's straight fire. Now you know what the fuck. That's sick. Obviously, they should be. And then the Fusion guys, they don't have any pins. They're trying to get one. They're trying to win the Overwatch League. They're trying to make up for it all, you know.
Yeah. Also, like I said on Twitter, Volamel said that he considers making every single stage playoff final an achievement in itself. And then I suggested, why not just like this to commemorate that? And it also sort of works, is to say, well, let's just call it to get the XL. Why not?
Like that's the first to do it.
Like famously in CS, when a player plays a specific position very well for a while, well, the people just call it that, don't they?
It permeates outside of that as well. Like way back in the day in Halo, there was specific callouts where I think there was a spot on a specific map where they called it Gandhi after the player, because you would always find him there, and he had his own specific kind of way to play that map. And it's something that I think in esports, again, ties back into that narrative where you're taking systems and concepts and kind of gifting them to the player in a sense that, this is kind of what you're known for and what you've popularized, and it kind of builds you up, like you're mentioning, Thorin, that like it ties it into your name, and it makes this really nice package of, when I hear Simple, I know exactly who I'm thinking of, but if I hear his name, who is Sasha? I don't know exactly who that is. It becomes
almost abstract in a mad way. Even though it's his real name, if you hear like, Alexander, whatever the fuck it is, some Ukrainian name, if anything, you almost have to go, who's like, right, Simple, you mean,
right?
Yeah.
Your brain kind of immediately drifts to, crazy ADR and, awesome plays. And, I saw that one play on Twitch or whatever. And yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. But one thing I wanted to touch on specifically with the stages, because that's something that I still kind of debate in my own kind of psyche, is that because of the way that the patching is cycled out stage by stage, it feels like that it kind of limits the season as a whole and makes stages important, but makes the season kind of very watered down because of how weak the narratives are, because it hasn't been the same ground, if that makes sense, or the same kind of playing field throughout the entire season. So you don't have like the most definitive answers to these questions, and you can't continue out those narratives. It's just like super bite-sized capsules that you unlock and interact with, which is really cool, but then they just completely get reset in the next stage, and it's just kind of, okay, well, maybe they'll be good now because of XYZ reason, and it just feels very
that's a famous narrative that has always triggered the fuck out of me, and I always try to find like people to proselytize with this in League of Legends.
Sure.
Is I hate the narrative that like the best team wins no matter what the meta
is. They always adapt or something.
Whereas every game I've ever seen, it's like a MOBA or like Overwatch, etc., tends to be like, unless you are absolute gods, like certain metas you would just not be able to win in. So there is an element of like, it's almost like fate determines who gets to be the champion. Whereas obviously in something like Counter-Strike, to some degree, the best team is the one winning. The game's not changing that much,
It's also, people actually think that it's just a lack of practice on the former best team. No, it's actually some metas. There is something inherent to these players. They have a special talent. Like, for instance, if you're a Sire player who's just nuts with one-click aim, right? And suddenly we're all playing like triple tank. Like, yes, you can have him practice, but that special talent won't come out in that specific meta, and that special thing that puts you ahead of other teams just won't come up. Like, you can't tell this guy to just go, well, just learn to right-click the Reinhardt shield more if you play Reinhardt. Like, that's it. It's simply,
it's because the way they phrase that is actually disingenuous. Because here's the problem. I can give you an exact analogy, because the same thing always happens in Counter-Strike, right? Where people say, this team who's like, the seventh best team. Well, typically it's very famous in Counter-Strike that it's all the best teams who have the super deep map pool, like, 5 or 6 maps. That's why they're the best teams, right? Because they're so good that they can play on all these different maps. And famously, if you go down to like the 5th or the 6th team, they're probably like really good on 2 maps, like 2 they're sort of decent on. They have to try and stay away from a couple more. Like, if they play a team that specializes in those maps, they're going to be in trouble because they're going to lose a map automatically in the series. What fans would always say is like, they should really be working to get better on those maps. And I always said this, like, the reason why that doesn't work as a statement is because rephrase it so it's actually an accurate statement. What you're saying is, this team who's, let's say, say the fourth best team on map A should practice map B, which they're not good on, and become a top 7 team in the world on that map. Like, if you put it like that, that suddenly sounds like a pretty fucking hard challenge, right? Remember, it's not just practice it and become good. You have to become so good that the teams that are beating you, you would beat them on that map, which obviously when we're talking about the best teams in the world, it's just not going to happen. So as you're saying here, if someone's a godlike player, I mean, obvious example would be like Jornak. If you're not playing Zenyatta anymore, it doesn't matter that you are the best player in the league. Is going to have an impact on you. It doesn't matter how good you are. I'm sure he practiced a fuck ton out of hands or whatever, you know.
It's also completely foregoing the concept of talent whatsoever. Like, what's your solution then? Build a time machine and tell these guys, like, please tell your parents they should conceive you a week later so your genes are then aligned to the meta. Like, it doesn't, like, make sense whatsoever. It's completely stupid.
The one thing you just know that's actually what Yiska would do. Like, his sort of like low-rent version of time travel is like it's the Back to the Future 1 version, isn't it? Like going back with the fucking sports almanac, the grey sports almanac. He'd just go back in time and tell like fucking Seoul Dynasty or something like, yeah, just remove Ri Jae-hong immediately. Bring in like that's what he'd use time travel for. Nothing important. Some shit like that. Right?
Yeah, pretty much.
He always sets you up for those crazy big, shifts in his stories, and I got to appreciate Yiska for that. If it's not time traveling, it's interacting with car tools in a very specific way, and you got to appreciate that. Yeah. Brings his own narratives.
So what do you think about this then? So one thing that I find, when you've been talking earlier about like what they'll do on the Overwatch League website and some of the mainstream journalism, that's kind of actually troubling when you think about it. Because I often used to make this case in League of Legends, right? That when I used to go a long time ago, we're talking like 10, 15 years ago, to the first ever Counter-Strike tournaments where, it was just a 2 or 3 day event. All the media was like on your website, there was no Reddit, there wasn't even YouTube at one point in time. If you upload an interview, someone had to download an interview. We're all doing like very, very basic context that you wouldn't even want to go back and watch some of these interviews. They just wouldn't be that interesting because they're very simple, they're just a post-match interview. But when we were doing all this, you would be shocked by how many press there would be at these events. Like a Counter-Strike event might literally have 50 or 60 press in the press room from Germany and France and Spain and Russia and USA. Like all the big sites would be there. Everyone was doing interviews, everyone was doing content. And then they first noticed this when I came into League of Legends, but it definitely applies to Overwatch. I came into League of Legends and I saw all these viewing figures that are like, 4 million people watching this match at Worlds, right. Or, this team's putting in hundreds of thousands of dollars. Like, and I thought, where the fuck are all the journalists? Like, where is everyone? Like, why is there like 10 people doing all this? Like, how can this be such a massive? So in case of Overwatch, how can it be like a hundreds of $1 million investment league with like all this mainstream attention? And this is an area that's it's kind of a shallow area. There's almost none of this types of content.
I think it's probably because the viewership numbers as raw numbers aren't actually that impressive. So if you're a journalist that tries to make it professionally and get those clicks off, and you don't have the same tools in order to make more out of your clicks like the Overwatch League does, right? They can maximize each viewer's like investment into whatever, like into their team. Like I would take every bet probably that the average Overwatch viewer spends more on the league, that being like jerseys or whatever, than every other esport, basically. So that is obviously not appealing to journalists. Like on a good piece, how much views can you really get? And you then don't have the ability to, crank up the revenue stream yet. Possibly, maybe. I don't know how that would go, but I think that is one of the big reasons. It's also like if there are well done pieces, they aren't really getting upvoted that much, are they? I mean, your piece, for instance, on GC Busan had like 100 upvotes, and I was very surprised that they got that much.
Yeah, I checked this morning, and I was pretty surprised because I didn't think it was going to do that great because it kind of read as a very kind of minimizing the team as a whole and just kind of focusing on this one aspect. So if I wasn't, talking about Bird Ring or somebody's favorite player, I could see them, necessarily downvoting it. But, it is what it is. I'm happy that it did well. But yeah, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying, for sure.
That's also something that's depressing to me, though, because obviously this is like there's no point going into the whole thing of like the split between the competitive Reddit and the main Overwatch subreddit. But I do feel like that is another limiting factor, because in something like League of Legends, when I first came into League of Legends, and my initial content was just like long form interviews, so all I had to do was research the player, ask good questions, and it doesn't really matter that I'm not an expert in the game. Then when I started trying to write some pieces, I went for narrative pieces, because again, I'm not an expert about MOBA games. Like, I can't break down like what amazing shit this guy's doing in lane with this champion. So instead, what I go with is like, let's tell his career story. Let's see what happened. Let's take some fragments from an interview and frame together some kind of like a storyline here and a progress path. Now, when I did that, those pieces would be very popular, because even though sometimes I'd be talking about a player in a team where like the hardcore fan knows like 90% of what I'm talking about, basically. He's heard it all before. Maybe if I do a good job, I'll piece it together in a way that's more pleasing, or he wants to reminisce over some of it. But the reason why I think it worked is because there would be a lot of casual fans who would be like, right, I'm a TSM fan, but I only started watching a year ago. So actually, I want to read this piece from 2 years ago, find out what the team was like, because that's exactly what I'm interested in knowing. And part of the problem I've noticed on the competitive Overwatch subreddit is it feels like all the people who comment on those sorts of threads are the hardcore fan who's like, I knew 95% of this anyway. What did this tell me? It's like, it's not for you then, is it then, dude? It's like, it's just for someone who wants to get like a primer or get like all the info, Like, the idea is not that every article Volamel writes has to be some like totally unique observation about the game and play that no one else has ever come up with. Like, that's a pretty ludicrous premise, and you wouldn't do that in sports journalism either. You wouldn't have to write totally brand new stuff. You can tell the story. You just change how you do it, hopefully.
Yeah, it's it's an obstacle that it's interesting to figure out how to overcome, because it is about kind of bringing in those kind of more casual fans that do just kind of play and have fun and all that good stuff. And I think the way that Blizzard has set up the Overwatch League, how it's in the client, there's jerseys for the teams to wear, so you're always kind of seeing, it's very kind of similar to seeing like a Lakers jersey on the street. It's like, oh, what's that about? And you kind of get maybe just a little bit of information you start to bring you in there, and it's just going to be a slow kind of churn, not to devolve into journalism talk, but I think it's just kind of reinventing how we write, not necessarily tailoring it to people, but just kind of adding something different and being almost more niche and more kind of different from the other people, and trying to develop your own brand and all that super business jargon talk.
Well, one thing I've noticed that you do, which by the way is actually somewhat advanced, like a lot of other narrative writers take a long time to figure this out, which is that, okay, say I'm doing a piece of content, right? So sometimes on my YouTube channel, if I do like an old Counter-Strike piece, it doesn't really matter when I do it, because, like it's some shit from 10 years ago, so it's not really going to be relevant no matter what. So I can do that whenever I want. I could release it at 4 a.m. Like the 10 people who want to watch that are going to watch it, right? They're going to enjoy it.
Right.
But the best way to do it is, like, even if you want to write an article about Faker, for example, is to time when you release it with when he does something, when he has a slump or when he has a success, or, even though the piece could be the exact same piece 3 months earlier, if you can sort of tap into that, you do somehow it sort of powers up the level of the piece. I've noticed, like, the significance, the impact is a lot more, it feels like.
Oh, 100%. Like, I cheekily retweet some older articles that I've written when, it makes sense to kind of have them reinserted into the scene because, the X player did really well, or this narrative either came to fruition or it didn't. It's kind of playing on that good PR, bad PR thing, where it's like, oh, look, this is what I had said previously, and this is not exactly what ended up coming true. So it makes more sense to kind of delve into that narrative and understand why maybe we were thinking that way, and then it ended up falling flat, and then we can go into like part 2 and explain why it ended up being more successful than what we have previously thought. But yeah, it's a lot of thinking about when and where, not necessarily just about just writing and delving into like very grandiose and cool storytelling aspects, but it's about scheduling things and being timely.
I have to say, it also sometimes really feels cheap. So for instance, when I make an observation in the game, right?
Sure. And
I go like, wow, this is pretty cool tech or whatever. Like, this actually really impacted this game. I could say, wow, Reinhardts have been using a lot of cool stuff. That would get 150 views on the subreddit. When I say Fissure does it, holy moly, now I'm getting all the clicks. And it does, like, at the same time, I'm thinking, well, people aren't really like that. Can they really be tricked by these like simple tricks? Can I really just reframe the same content? They don't even watch anyway, by the way. They click in,
they read
see
the
like
title.
the first, like
Yeah.
I think like the first 20 seconds or whatever of the video basically make up their opinion, and then it's already comments. Now I am the content creator, so this is I don't know.
I have always loved people who really want you to know their opinion about some content they didn't read. It's like, what a bizarre. I'll never understand that impulse, because people would think naively that I'm someone who's like super opinionated, all this of it. Like, if I didn't work in esports, I'd never post a single comment on the fucking internet. Like, I was on Quake websites for years, didn't even have an account, because why would I need it? Used to be able to just download without an account, so I wasn't in there. Actually, Kool-Aid's the best player. Like, who gives a fuck? I thought that in my own mind. Why would I want some cretin to know that? I'm not going to argue with them about it.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't that.
That is just framing being antisocial. It's like a fucking superpower there, isn't it? Like, I do realize I did try to play that off like it was fucking swag or something. I don't need people, Yiska. I am an island.
The hilarious part is, for the most part of 2017, it felt to me like I had to get on every single hill because so many bullshit narratives were peddled that also then actually shape reality. Like I saw players getting picked up on narratives that really don't hold true that much anymore, because also like the GMs are also just people, and they're all susceptible to all these biases, but it's still like, why? Like it almost feels like an obligation to make yourself seem less, nice by just, seeing a bad opinion or a bad narrative continuously repeated, and for you to then not say, well, it's not really true. Like, here are the stats, for instance, that completely refute this. Well, you're probably not really changing anyone. And that's also the interesting part. People who actually write these pieces and who actually put a lot of thought in them, they can't expect high amounts of hits, but they sure as hell can expect interaction from people higher up in the industry, can't they? So, like, even if you feel like you're not making any money off of that, it's also very short-sighted. I had that very discussion recently about some journalist, and he's a good guy. He went like, well, I have to pay my bills, and I have to write the articles that are the most famous. And I'm like, okay, so let's go through this in Overwatch. People who wrote analytical content or produced analytical content, Kirby, Harsha, Sideshow, like, who's winning here really, right? Is this just short-sighted, or could you, if you are capable of writing these art, like, do you need to continue writing is basically what I'm asking. And if the answer is yes, you want to continue writing, okay, trot right ahead. If you just want to stay in the scene, well, sure as hell, create some content pieces. There's still some expansion teams. We've also found out that a couple of coaches and analysts are not worth their salt either. There should be a lot of opportunities for everyone right now. And writing these analytical pieces, even if you incorporate narrative into that, which then makes it go down better and also shows the org that you can actually tell a compelling story that sort of convinces players to do certain stuff, that certainly is good on your resume.
I'd like to think so, or at least I hope so. But to one of your points, I thought you brought up really well was the kind of false narratives that you were so unabashedly swinging at for a good couple months. And funnily enough, we actually became friends because we butted heads on a specific point, and we took it to DMs, and it was pretty cool. But one of the big ones that I think I hear even echoed to this day is Jaehong, and by no means do I think Jaehong was a bad player. I think he's actually quite good, but the time frame of when the tone shifted away from him being the world's greatest player, it seems like it never really it's starting to kind of decrescendo a little bit, but it's so surprising to me that people are so attached to him specifically. I don't think I've seen anyone else specifically in Overwatch that fans just kind of latch onto, kind of similar, I don't know, it's not a great example, but it feels like Baxter in a sense. Where it's like, oh yeah, Baxter's so good, man. Like he's just going to go in and win.
By the way, dude, because literally in StarCraft 2, like he was only good like very briefly early on, right? But even years later, people would act as though he was still one of the best players in the world, you know, just because they were in love with the nostalgia of how good he was 10 years earlier.
It's like if someone actually writes right now that Jaehong is still one of or the best support player in the game, I'm like, I'm so sorry you were in a coma for literally a year now. Like, obviously not true anymore.
And he has good skill sets, but we can't just continue to say that he's the best player. He was good for a period. Yes, I completely and we'll champion that. He was a great Ana player. He was good for Apex Season 2. He wasn't even that bad in Apex Season 1, but post that, when he was forced to play the Zenyatta, it just was never the same player. They always just were kind of... I remember a match specifically on Iconwald. I can't remember exactly who they were playing against. They were trying to push through point A. The Zen wasn't working. They swapped to Ana. It actually kind of slowly grinds out and they end up taking it. And it's just that kind of nostalgia of like, oh, if Jaehong could only play Ana, everything would be solved, and you know, Seoul would be the best team in the world. And it's like, I love that people are so attached to it and interactive with that, but it's just like rose tinted is all get out. Like, so it bothers me to no end.
It's also, just look at that. There are still pieces being written about Jaehong. How many pieces have you seen on Bedosin? That kid was boss balling out of control while also having a sort of like interesting personality around him, and obviously like has mad banter now. He was that all along, guys. Just nobody ever bothered to ask him or get that out of him, right? So and basically, if you look at the finals teams, I think only EQO's narrative was sort of like told a little bit, you know, the laptop stuff where he was playing with 40 FPS or whatever. But like, that's really it. If you're thinking like, who else received a long like feature piece? I can't remember a single one of these players that actually played in the final.
The one thing I would say, and again, it wasn't specifically for the final, towards the beginning of the league, during the preseason, they had those kind of like Heroes Reborn kind of trailers where it was like, you know, the players are in, you know, I think IDDQD was in like some sort of Arctic environment throwing axes at stuff, and they kind of detailed Mickey's past in other games, or specifically this other game that he was a world champion in. And that was kind of the start of it, and I kind of wish they would have continued that because it was really interesting and it was well produced, so it automatically grabbed people in. But yeah, since then it's been a little lacking, and it was just kind of post-match interview, tie in, you know, some loose points, and then, you know, cap it off and send it out to the editor. And yeah, we're missing those. It feels like we're always going back to the history of these players and tie in how your family feels, and tie in what you ate for dinner and all that very, very surface level stuff, because it's that sugar that makes the medicine go down easier. But really get into how they struggled, you know, talk to Bedosin, talk about how he's never really won anything. You know, this is his first like big championship, obviously stage 1, but you know, Call of Duty never really found success. They're another one of those teams that just kind of were stuck in that kind of silver medalist mindset and never really achieved or were able to push past that point. They always plateaued in the finals and the grand finals. They had their chance against Lunatic High in Apex Season 3, but it was all for naught.
Yeah. I mean,
one thing that's actually really worrying to me, though, is it's one thing if it's just a narrative that someone's saying on Twitter who's a fan, or someone's writing a throwaway piece where they, again, as you're saying, reference like Ryu Jaehong's like one of the best supports, even though that hasn't been the case for almost the entire Overwatch League. That's one thing, because as much as to you or I, where it's life or death, like whether or not people have interest in the story, yeah, that does matter. But in theory, it doesn't impact too much. It's just like an idea. The one area I get worried about, and we're not going to go like into an entire like digression here about the specifics, is obviously people who are in the media are voting for MVPs. And this is something where, I would stress to people, do not follow the method of traditional sports, because famously in some of the sports I follow, like the NHL, the NBA, right, 20 or 30 years ago, they really did give you the MVP if you were generally the best player. Like, sure, they had some weird rules, like, you know, you have to still like have one of your teams has to be like, maybe like top ranked or something. You can't be like the middle of the pack team or something. Sure, they'd use that logic, which sometimes can be a bit wonky. But generally, if you really are, like if you're Wayne Gretzky, there's a reason why he did win loads of MVPs. Well, one of the sad things about the modern day of media, where obviously journalists have now heavily stressed narratives, and especially aspects of like people's career stories of like, oh, who is he? He's never won the MVP. They got this concept, which if you're a purist, it's terrible. It's the concept of voter fatigue. So when you're someone like a Michael Jordan, a LeBron James, even if you took this year that they played okay, and the rest of their career didn't exist, and you asked someone, right, who was the best player in the league, they'd say, well, it's Michael Jordan now. Because Michael Jordan and LeBron James won too many MVPs, people literally began trying to find ways not to give them the MVP. As in like, well, we gave him that last year, so, that's kind of a boring story, even though to me, obviously, it's a 6 story, I've won 6 of them, whatever it is. So they would start trying to find a way to be like, right, well, this guy was sort of the third best, he's had a better season than the past, and so, maybe he's the MVP, and then they tie in these whack narratives, and so that's actually impacting history, because, someone's going to look back and see the MVP and think, right, he was the best player that year, I haven't seen this year, but, I can trust that that's accurate. Already we've started to see that creep in Overwatch. Yeah,
because 100%. The muscle of those journalists is to find interesting narratives and like try to explain a certain, unpopular opinion that really isn't that well supported, but like bringing out interesting ideas in itself has value, right? Probably not in an actual, MVP debate where we're really trying to find out where that actually, by the way, most valued player has value and lasting value for like decades potentially, right? So to make this about anything else but, especially because we do in Overwatch have a second award that could serve as all these other factors you want to see on it, right? And talked about and make that for them. I even, to a degree, I actually don't really want journalists in these votes because like that was also pretty problematic in itself. Who are the most knowledgeable people about Overwatch? And if you're not asking the players, probably the coaches, right? Well, allowing the coaches to vote for their own team is always going to end up whack, won't it? So, like, exclude them from that. Have them in there. Have some experts, actually people who have the title of analysts, for instance, league analysts and whatever. Have these submit their opinions, making it perfectly clear what the definition of an MVP is and how it is serious and how it's not a creative outlet for their own ego to, get that out. Because, by the way, nobody's reading your pieces about the MVPs either, or you didn't produce them. And, like, you putting in mistakes or whatever without writing any pieces on that really doesn't have any value, does it? So... like the entire premise of the thing is so flawed in a sense. It's also I'm not aware, but isn't the MVP trophy in American sports usually actually about the best player? Or is that not what it is anymore?
Generally, but like I say, it has been somewhat, it's like half and half now. It's like, here's the thing, to win the MVP in like the NHL or the NBA, you do have to be like probably a minimum top 3 or 4 player, and you have to have your team be very good. So that narrows the field down. Usually each season, you mainly have 2 candidates by the end, like a third person will drop out. Now, I will tell you something that'll trigger the fuck out of you, Yiska. One of the things they do in those sports where you play like 80 games in the regular season is when there's 2 people and they're both competing for the MVP, when their teams play each other in the last game that they're going to play each other in the season, people make that a big deciding point. Like, oh, but LeBron did beat him in that game, so maybe he's just won the MVP. Like, people actually do that.
It's a 1v1.
Yeah, they really do like add that narrative in, Or like, for example, there was a season where Kevin Durant and LeBron James, I think, were going back and forth. And in one game, Kevin Durant scored like 58 points. And then a week later, LeBron scored like 60 points. And they were like, oh, he's replied back. It's like, it's one game. What are you talking about? Like, it wasn't like after that week, he was like, right, well, sorry guys, forget the game, but I have to score over 58 points. Otherwise, this MVP's going away.
Recency bias is a crazy drug. Like, just as a heuristic for people that actually want to have a respectable opinion, if you don't have to write down what you're thinking about, you're probably not considering enough factors and long enough of a time frame to make that decision. Because, like, I even think to a degree, and this will sound mad coming from me, I think Prophet is a little bit overhyped now. Like, I think the term, like, yes, he was the finals MVP. People went way too hard because of these 2 plays that he made on Hanzo and Tracer. Well, Fury also had a mad final. Gesture was a motherfucking monster. Like, that team completely popped off, right? Where you could once again say maybe Birdring was the worst player on Spitfire. Like, how mad is that, right? So that is also one thing that completely, like, the fact how hard recency bias is, and even if been made aware of that very fact, I could make it as an argument, say, you're weighting this a little bit too much, and if you're putting it on the playoffs, completely fair. I understand that you weight those more, but if it's only about the recency, like, what are you doing? I can even mention it in my reply to you that there is such a thing as recency bias. You will go like, click Wikipedia article. Yeah, that sounds what I don't have that. Like,
that sounds like what everyone else has got, but not me.
Yeah.
It's mad.
That's usually how it works, right?
Yeah, I would tend to. I think that, again, I think things have changed with Prophet. I think obviously you've led that charge. And yeah, he has very specific clips that are very, highlighted and touted as being, godlike. But that's something that he's always consistently done. One of the most, fun memories that I have, watching Apex is the Apex Season 4 finals, where he just pulls out Genji after never running it and is able to go toe-to-toe with Haksal. Yes, there's a team around them, and I think that GC Busan ended up being able to shut down a very kind of aggressive Genji play from Runaway. But being able to just switch that in the finals and then kind of carry Hureg, who was very, very obviously not comfortable on Tracer in the slightest, being able to carry both of that weight on a hero that he's never publicly played, that's some crazy shit.
People don't understand, man. Like, he comes in on Genji, and people think he was dominating the finals. He, in fact, also had some of the best stats. Definitely was way better than Carpe. Carpe got like 80% of the kills of Prophet in that final, if I remember correctly.
You mean Haksal?
No, it's now in the
okay, the Overwatch
right?
final. Sure.
Like, it was something like Prophet at 80 and Carpe then had like 60 something, right? Mm. In the Apex Season 4 finals, it was very close that Prophet doubled Haksar's kills. We've never in the history of Overwatch seen such a carry performance. How many viewers actually know about that when they're watching the finals broadcast? Absolutely zero. Right? And that's like, people legitimately made the argument to me, oh yeah, by the way, Carpe is a big game player. Mate, he has never won a final in his life. How is that
DK
possible?
Stars, you know that team? You ever seen them in the final? No. Yeah, like, come on.
Well, the mad thing about that is, like, a lot of the content you're talking about now, Yiska, it would actually be ideally suited to the broadcast. Like, this is where, coming into this match, you should have a whole... Like, for example, when the Gladiators played against the Spitfire, there should have been an entire 20-minute segment where it was, like, players around the league talking earlier in the season, like, wow, Fisher turned everything around for this squad, one of the best tanks in the league. And then it was, like, building into the idea of, like, but he's not here for the playoffs. Like, what does that mean for them as a squad? You should have built that whole thing up, whereas instead, again, it's like we always say, if you only watch the playoffs, you don't even know Fisher exists. As far as you know, that is London Gladiators, and they won the first series, so it's fine. They were just an okay team. That's no biggie.
Yeah, I mean, that in itself is such a unreal narrative, right? That you would that sacrifice that just to. I mean, that's also something that keeps on carrying forward, because the clear message of that is nobody's bigger than the team, right? So how does that fare for Gladiators in the coming seasons? We need to establish that premise now in order to then use it later on and build that narrative. Because if they win the next season and win the season afterwards, well, I guess then nobody should be bigger than the team if they actually stuck to those. If they win the finals next season and they actually had a very rowdy, like, star player, what if they keep Fisher and they keep playing him in playoffs, he goes absolutely ham and whatever, and they say, well, maybe sometimes there are reasons to have the player be bigger than everyone else. Well, that's on the narrative too, right? nobody's establishing that.
Plus, when you have NYXL doing so well in all these stages, how was there not a narrative piece about Wizard Hyung? Like, the guy literally just gave you all this mystique, all these, like, cool storylines. Half of it, was probably exaggerated, but that's like they just handed that out on a silver platter. That would get people who know nothing about the game super interested. I mean, they do the same in other sports. Like if Bill Belichick of the New England Patriots or whatever, if they do a documentary about him, you don't actually have to know about football to see that, like, you know, his drives, what keeps him going, and the way he breaks the game down and gets through his star player. Like, that's fucking amazing content. That'll draw you right in. And in fact, I have to say, the content that in other sports tends to drive a lot of the interest isn't even just the game. It's not like, oh, well, these are the two teams playing, so you have to watch. Like in the NFL, they love to do content like that behind the scenes where they're just filming everything. And then after the fact, you know, win or lose, you figure out how you're going to frame it. And then probably the best example, I think, ever of a sport that runs on narrative, it's got to be the UFC, MMA, because MMA took a lot of cues from the WWE and they figured out how to get someone, for example, who, I mean, I've done this myself, obviously. If you're someone who's never going to be like the most popular player, but you're one of the best, well, then why not just become the villain? Why not become the guy where people have to watch you fight because they want to see you lose? And you know what? You're fighting a guy that they love. What a fucking great storyline. And, oh, you two fought earlier in your careers, but so much has changed since. Those are like, that sort of behind the scenes content is the stuff that like people go crazy for in UFC. Like that's really, really anticipated material.
100%, and that's kind of what, and not to make this UFC talk, but that's a great example is one of the next kind of big UFC events where I think it's Cody Garbrandt versus TJ Dillashaw, former teammates, you know, now rivals. They had their spat on a reality show and almost got into fistfights. Like that grips me, and I'm not even that big into MMA, and I'm already kind of like looking forward to seeing the results of that. So to your point, 100%, like that gets people interested, and it has nothing to do with them actually fighting. It's just between their interaction and their own kind of narrative in a vacuum.
What depresses me though is like we have a company who's done this sort of stuff, but unfortunately it's OGN, and if you notice, they're getting sort of nudged out of most esports that they were in, and they're not really any more the big guys because they were the ones who they just understood it so well. I mean, one of the things that they actually do that essentially is also a narrative element is, to this day, I still don't know how in every game, StarCraft, League of Legends, Overwatch, how are they so good with production that with no live delay, they can switch to the face of the player who just got wrecked by the Genji blade when he should have like won this fight, you know? They can instantly get his reaction without missing the rest of the action, then go back in. Like, however they do that, that is like magic. Like, whoever the fuck learned that, you know, it's obviously not the same people. This is years later, you know, but that style that they've built up, it's incredible. It really does hook you in a way that just watching the game can't.
Yeah. No, OGN are masterful at this. And I also think while Blizzard did a pretty good job on the finals intro, like the intros OGN made for all the Apex finals was just above and beyond for me, like in comparison, simply because how it summons up this, you know, the importance of it all, right? And like they have special kind of music that they pick as well. It's like Blizzard are the masters of game music. Why is this not translating to the Overwatch League broadcast whatsoever? Maybe they're actually not thinking that it should be like a, you know, super epic event, the finals, or at least they're not producing that way. And to me, this is sort of like a stylistic choice. It's not something that necessarily can be said to be objectively wrong if we accept the premise of having, you know, meaning in the competition. But like, I think also, why not just, you know, talk to them or hire them even, right? I mean, not sure if that's possible any longer after they basically, you know, screwed them out of Overwatch, but yeah.
Yeah, OGN's great. You know, looking at what they've done with like League, and they make their openings for League of Legends and the LCK has always been something that I've really enjoyed watching because it's creating narratives without any words. It's like you have the kind of 90s emo rock music playing in the background, and then it's all this crazy symbolism and stuff that you're not going to pick up on if you're not like a hardcore fan, but it's still really well produced that like even as like a casual fan, I'm just like, wow, that's really cool. And then it kind of makes me interested, like, okay, so what does this mean? It's like this weird like out of college artsy film, but with music to it. it's really cool. Definitely check that out if you're interested in that kind of stuff.
That's actually one thing where I do think they missed a trick in the Overwatch League, because another aspect that they often did with some of those videos was they would tie in whatever champion or race you play in the game with the star player. So the idea is, just from the intro, I know that like, Madlife's a Thresh player. Like, if he plays that champion, I'm going to be really lucky, you know. They should have been doing that in the Overwatch League. Like, this would be a very simple way to communicate to people in the intro who is the star player, who's the best tracer, who does the best Widowmaker shit. You know, like, it would be so easy to do this because you don't even have to overtly communicate. It's just part of the ambience of what you're setting up, the aesthetic that you watch.
Yeah. And they did that a little bit specifically with like Pine, where it's just like, oh, big boss Pine, he's coming in on Ilios. I just want more of that, you know, as crazy as it is. And, you know, people talk about like the WWE and they want him to come out like the Undertaker or some crazy shit like that. You know, taking it to that level would almost kind of be really kind of cheesy, but in a fun way, where it's like, it pushes that same narrative that you're talking about, where it's like, I know exactly what to expect in this map because I know this player is so highly touted on Thresh or McCree or whatever. I'm an op main, or you know, I'm like a star with the AK or whatever the hell you want to call it. You know, it builds them up again, kind of doubling back to the names and what's really in a name, as cliche as that is. You know, this builds into that same package where it's like, you hear Pine, I know exactly what I'm expecting. If I hear mistakes, it's like, okay, well, what exactly, who are you, what you know, what are you about? And I just want more of that kind of definition of who is mistakes, who is Saya player. We know who Saya player is. I think they've done a fairly good job. We know who Pine is. I think that's been belabored to a degree that it's kind of sickening. We know Jonak, but building some of these other players up that have kind of star performances that aren't necessarily Prophet, for example. It's like, where was that definition? And it wasn't really defined until the finals, where he was literally forcing it down your mouth and saying, you have to notice me. So I just want, give me more.
I also think the Pine piece in particular, for how short it was an absolute meaning bomb. There's this line where he goes, well, after the stage 1 finals, which we lost, and by the way, at this point, like, teams took it really seriously until they realized that nobody else takes it really seriously. So we can take it less seriously now. But he goes like, there's a quote in that piece where he goes like, do I have to continue existing now? And this tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah, really, it's just like,
you need to know about the drive these players or the goals, right? This is not normal behavior for like an adjusted human, but at the same time, that's pretty fucking baller, isn't it? Like, that's someone so invested into their craft. They have the clear goal in mind, what they want to achieve. They are willing to do everything in their power to achieve it. And then it gets narrowly taken away from them in a sick upset, if we remember back, right? Mm-hmm. Like, this is obviously crushing. So, like, to set this up, and then, I mean, it's kind of obvious that this was produced to be shown at the finals, because, well, if I'm an editor, or if I'm the editor of that, I go to experts. I go to Monty and go like, who do you think will make the finals? Probably NYXL. Sweet, I'll do a Pine piece. Well, it didn't turn out that way, did it? So I think that was meant to be a finals piece, and then they were like, okay, now we got to produce some. And I mean, the Prophet stuff was, they did some, it didn't have the same quality. And sometimes is also, by the way, it's not only always on the people, because I remember, I had this interview series called The Essence of Heroes, where I try to capture what it's like to be a pro player and what it's like to be the specific hero in the game, and how that sort of entwines, right? How these characteristics of these two entities sort of like dance around each other and then become something special, right? And you can make the most deep sounding questions, and in your mind you're already filling the mystique of the responses. And if your player selection wasn't like correct, it's really like, yes, very much like this. Then that was the answer.
Yeah.
So
you kind of have to work with what you're given sometimes, and it's I think if you've ever tried to interview a player ever, even if you've done 5 or a bajillion interviews, sometimes you're just gonna get those. It's like, well, how did you feel after you've reached your goals and you've become legendary and you've captured history as they kind of force that. It's like, yeah, it feels good. It's like,
but that in itself can be a narrative, right?
Sure, yeah. Again, it's putting forth the effort to make that interesting and work with what you're given. So yeah, I 100% agree.
I mean, that's one of the worst inflictions, I also think, is if writers or content creators overstretch the narrative and really try to make it sort of
I've done that. I made a career off of doing that, especially early on. I made some crazy, mythological to Genji, and it was a bit weird, but I decided that I was going to flex the creative muscle. But yeah, it's pushing the boundaries and trying to find the range of what's too mythological and creative and what's too dull, and then finding that center point.
Hey, as a teacher, I know as long as your literature, or in this case, gameplay analysis, is sort of coherent and also follows like a red string of logic, that's completely fine. Everyone will be, satisfied with that if it's easy to follow.
Yeah.
So
this video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Eddie Wingfors, Daniel Yordanov, Robert Baxter, Travis Greb, Kyla Harris, James Harding, Caesar, and special thanks go out to Matt Shakowski and Jerky's Minion in particular. Want teasers for my upcoming content? How about asking me a question for my monthly AMA? Do you want to take part in a discussion about esports with me? How about suggesting a topic or a guest for my content? Put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today.